The rain lashed against the trees, a relentless downpour that turned the forest paths into rivers of mud. Naima had been walking for hours, her feet sore, her body exhausted. She hadn't meant to travel this far from the village, but the storm had caught her off guard. The sky had darkened too quickly, the wind had howled too fiercely, and now she was alone in a place she did not know. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating a small hut tucked between the towering trees. Relief surged through her. Shelter. She hurried toward it, her heart hammering against her ribs as she knocked on the heavy wooden door. For a long moment, there was no answer, only the drumming of rain on the thatched roof. Then, the door creaked open. The man who stood there was unlike any she had ever met. He was tall, his frame broad, his presence commanding. Dark eyes watched her beneath the flickering glow of the hut's lone lantern. He did not speak at first, only studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Naima hesitated, but another burst of thunder shook the sky, and she had little choice. She stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the small space wrap around her like a cloak. A fire crackled in the corner, casting shadows along the walls. The scent of burning wood and something faintly spiced filled the air. "Thank you," she murmured, shivering as she stepped further in. The man nodded but said nothing. His silence unnerved her. She had expected questions, who she was, where she was from, why she was here, but he offered none. Instead, he moved toward the fire, adding another log, the flames flickering higher. The light revealed the sharp angles of his face, the set of his jaw, the way his hands moved with a quiet strength. There was something about him, something restrained, as if he carried a weight too heavy to speak of. Naima sat on the small wooden bench near the fire, rubbing her arms to chase away the chill. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the trees like unseen spirits. She told herself she was safe. The hut was sturdy, the fire warm. The stranger had let her in without question. There was nothing to fear. Then, she heard it, the quiet, deliberate click of a lock sliding into place. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned her head. The man stood by the door, his fingers resting against the wooden latch. His gaze met hers, unreadable, unwavering. The flames flickered, their light dancing in his dark eyes. Something changed in the air between them. Her pulse quickened, not just with fear, but something else. Awareness. A tension so thick it wrapped around her like the heat of the fire. He had locked the door, but he had not moved toward her. He only watched, as if waiting to see what she would do. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Naima's pulse quickened as she took a cautious step back, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall of the hut. The dim glow of the lanterns flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mind racing. "Safer from what?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man didn't answer immediately. He turned away from her, reaching for a small iron pot over the fire, stirring its contents with slow, deliberate movements. His silence was heavy, the kind that made the air feel thick, suffocating. She studied him through the dim light. His skin was dark as the night beyond the hut, his bare shoulders broad, marked with faint scars. He moved with a quiet certainty, as if he owned not just the space but everything within it, including her. "You shouldn't have been out there alone," he finally said, his voice deep, unhurried. "The storm is the least of your worries." A shiver ran through her, but she forced herself to keep her chin up. She wasn't some helpless girl. She had made it this far on her own. But there was something about him, something unreadable in his posture, in the way he had locked the door without hesitation. She shifted her gaze, searching for a way out. The hut was small, simple. A narrow sleeping mat lay in the corner, beside a crude wooden table. Shelves lined the walls, holding dried herbs, clay bowls, and old relics she didn't recognize. But there were no windows. Only the door. The door he had locked. She moved toward it slowly, testing his reaction. He didn't stop her. He just watched. Her fingers brushed the iron latch, cold under her touch. She tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge. "You won't get far," he murmured. She turned to him, heat rising in her chest. "Open it." His dark eyes met hers, unwavering. "No." Her breath hitched. "Why?" "You're not ready to hear that." Anger flared in her, mingling with something else, something more dangerous than fear. "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice sharp. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "No. You don't." He took a step closer, and she resisted the urge to retreat. "But you stepped into my world, and now, you follow my rules." The fire crackled between them, throwing gold light onto his face. His features were strong, almost carved, his expression unreadable. She clenched her fists. "What do you want from me?" He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "I want you to listen." "To what?" The wind howled outside, rattling the walls, as if answering for him. "To the things that only come out when the storm hides them." The fire crackled low in the center of the hut, throwing wavering shadows against the wooden walls. Naima sat stiffly on the woven mat he had offered her, her body wrapped in the dry clothes he had given. They were far too big, clearly his, but they were warm, carrying his scent, something earthy and deep. She pulled the fabric tighter around herself, watching him from the corner of her eye. The man moved with quiet efficiency, placing a bowl of steaming stew in front of her. His muscles shifted under his dark skin as he crouched near the fire, his expression unreadable. "You still haven't told me your name," she said, breaking the silence. He didn't look at her. "I don't have one." She frowned. "That's not possible. Everyone has a name." "Not me." His voice was even, calm, as if he had accepted this as fact long ago. Naima studied him, trying to piece together what kind of man he was. His presence was unsettling, yet there was no cruelty in his actions. He had locked the door, yes, but he had also fed her, clothed her, and ensured she was warm. Still, there was something beneath the surface, something unspoken, restrained. "Did you forget it?" she pressed. This time, his gaze flicked up to her, his dark eyes sharp. "No." "Then why won't you tell me?" He smirked, a slow, almost amused curve of his lips. "Names have power. I don't give mine to just anyone." A strange shiver ran down her spine. There was something in his voice, something weighty, as if his name wasn't just a word but a secret too dangerous to share. She took a slow bite of the stew, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why did he live out here alone, deep in the forest, with no name and no fear? Despite herself, she felt drawn to the mystery of him. "How long do you plan to keep me here?" she asked after a moment. His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stirred the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. "You should sleep," he said. She exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." Frustration burned inside her, but she didn't push further. Not yet. She needed to understand him first, to know what drove him, what he wanted from her. The wind outside shifted, carrying an eerie sound through the cracks in the wood. A distant wail, hollow and unnatural. She stiffened. What was that? He didn't look at her. "Don't listen to it." The noise came again, closer this time, a sound that wasn't quite human. She swallowed. "What is out there?" For the first time since she arrived, his expression changed. A flicker of something crossed his face, something almost like regret. "You don't want to know." Naima's skin prickled. And then, just as the fire crackled low, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the hut. The storm had begun to settle, but the wind still carried eerie whispers through the trees. Naima sat rigid near the fire, every muscle in her body tense. The stranger, the man with no name, sat across from her, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The metallic sound scraped against her nerves, yet he seemed unaffected by the unease pressing into the air around them. She wanted to ask again why he had locked the door, why he was keeping her here, but her mind was fixed on something else, the stories she had heard before she ever set foot in this cursed land. Asterisk, people go into that forest, but they don't come back. Asterisk. The words of an old woman from her village echoed in her mind. She had laughed then, dismissing it as another one of the elders' superstitions. But now, in this isolated hut, with the weight of the man's unreadable gaze on her, she wasn't so sure. She cleared her throat. I've heard stories about this place. About how people disappear. His hand stilled on the blade for just a fraction of a second before he continued sharpening it. And you came anyway. I didn't believe them. He let out a low chuckle, though there was no amusement in it. You should have. Naima crossed her arms, frustration warring with fear. Are you trying to scare me? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. If I wanted to scare you, I'd tell you the truth. A chill slid down her spine. Then tell me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the walls of the hut, and she almost thought he wouldn't answer. But then, his voice came, low and steady. This village was abandoned long ago. The people left, but something else stayed behind. It watches. It waits. And when someone wanders too far into its land, it takes them. Naima swallowed. Takes them where? His dark eyes held hers. No one knows. A shiver ran through her, though she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. That's just a legend. His jaw tightened. Is it? Before she could respond, something moved outside the hut. Her breath caught. It was faint, barely a sound at all, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. Slow, deliberate footsteps pressing against the damp earth. She turned to the door, her pulse quickening. Did you hear that? The man didn't move, didn't even turn his head. Stay where you are. Her heart pounded as she shifted toward the door. Who is out there? Finally, he stood, moving in one fluid motion. He crossed the room, reaching for the bough that leaned against the wall. His entire body was tense, alert, like a predator sensing danger. She barely breathed as she followed his gaze to the small crack between the wooden planks of the hut. The storm had pulled some of the trees apart, allowing slivers of moonlight to cast pale beams onto the forest floor. And then, she saw it. Just beyond the trees, half hidden by the mist, a figure stood completely still. Her blood ran cold. Its eyes, glowing, unnatural, watched her through the darkness. The air inside the hut was thick with something unspoken. The fire crackled between them, but it wasn't enough to chase away the tension that had settled like a storm ready to break. Naima sat near the flames, her arms wrapped around herself, not from the cold, but from the weight of his presence. The stranger was too still, too controlled, watching her without truly looking at her. She hated how he made her feel. Trapped. Not just in this hut, not just by the storm, but by something far more dangerous. You're too quiet, she finally said, her voice cutting through the silence. He glanced at her, then back at the blade he was idly running his fingers over. And you talk too much. She scoffed. That's because I don't like silence. It makes me think too much. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. And thinking scares you? No, she said, shifting toward him, but you do. His eyes darkened, but he said nothing. The space between them felt smaller than before, as if the walls had closed in. She shouldn't push him. She knew better. But the night was long, and she was tired of pretending she didn't feel the pull between them. Why did you lock the door? She asked, tilting her head, watching for any reaction. I already told you, he said, voice calm, unreadable. It's safer this way. Safer for who? She let her fingers drag along the wooden floor. For me? Or for you? His jaw tensed. He didn't answer. That was enough of an answer. She smiled, slow and knowing. I think you're afraid of me. Finally, he looked at her, really looked. The weight of it sent a shiver down her spine. You don't know what you're saying, he murmured. Don't I? She leaned forward slightly, letting the glow of the firelight dance across her skin. You locked the door to keep me in, but maybe it's because you don't trust yourself around me. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her wrist, not roughly, but firm enough that she felt his strength. His warmth. Her breath hitched. You think this is a game? His voice was low, dangerous. No, she whispered. But I think you're lying to yourself. His grip tightened, just for a moment, before he let her go as if she burned him. He pushed back, putting space between them again, jaw clenched. Go to sleep, Naima, he said, his voice hoarse. She should listen. She should turn away, close her eyes, and ignore the fire that burned between them. But she didn't. Because the real danger wasn't the storm. It wasn't the thing in the forest. It was the way her body betrayed her every time he was near. The storm raged on, but inside the hut, the silence between them was louder. Naima sat by the fire, her body tense as she watched the man who had kept so many secrets. She had pushed him, tested him, but now, she needed answers. Tell me the truth, she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. Who are you? The stranger didn't answer at first. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. The flames cast shadows across his sharp features, making him look like something carved from the night itself. You wouldn't believe me, he finally said. Naima huffed. Try me. He exhaled slowly, then looked up, and for the first time since she had entered the hut, she saw something raw in his gaze. I was born here, he said. But I was never meant to stay. His voice was quiet, but there was a weight to it, like he was speaking of something that had already been decided long ago. This land, his fingers traced the handle of the knife on his belt. It doesn't let go of those who belong to it. Naima frowned. What does that mean? He didn't answer, only stood and moved to the wooden door. He placed a hand against it, as if feeling for something unseen. I locked the door for a reason, he murmured. Naima's breath hitched. To keep me in? No, he turned, his dark eyes holding hers. To keep them out. The wind howled, rattling the hut, and for the first time, Naima felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Them, she echoed. He gestured toward the walls, the shadows flickering as the lanterns danced. The things outside. They wait for nightfall. They wait for people like you, people who don't understand what lurks beyond the trees. She swallowed. You're trying to scare me. I don't have to, he said, stepping closer. You've already felt it, haven't you? Naima wanted to deny it, but she couldn't forget the glowing eyes she had seen, the eerie whispers in the wind. What are they? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. They were once men, he said. But the land took them. Now, they hunt. They wait for anyone foolish enough to wander too far. A shiver ran down her spine. And you? His jaw tightened. I should have been one of them. Naima's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She wanted to move, to step back, but her body refused. Why aren't you? She asked. His lips parted, but before he could answer, a sound outside made them both freeze. A low, guttural growl. Not an animal. Not a man. Something else. The fire flickered, the lanterns dimmed, and Naima realized the real danger had just begun. The storm outside raged on, but inside the hut, another storm was brewing, one neither of them could ignore. The lanterns flickered, casting long shadows along the walls, but Naima barely noticed. She was too aware of the man standing in front of her, the way his presence filled the space, thickening the air between them. The growl from outside had faded, but the danger hadn't. She could still feel it lurking beyond the door, watching, waiting. Yet, her body wasn't tense from fear alone. She hated the way he unsettled her. The way her pulse quickened every time his gaze lingered on her too long. You're shaking, he murmured, stepping closer. She forced herself to hold his gaze. Maybe I should be. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't look away. You're not afraid of me. It wasn't a question. Naima swallowed hard. Should I be? His fingers curled at his sides, as if restraining himself. He had spent the night keeping his distance, but there was something different in his stance now. A crack in the control he'd held so tightly. I don't know what you want from me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darkened. Neither do I. The words sent a shiver through her. Because she knew, deep down, that this was no longer just about the dangers outside. The storm raged on, but the real battle was within these walls. Between fear and something else. Something hotter. Naima should have kept her distance. Should have reminded herself that this man was a stranger, that she was trapped with him, not by choice. But the truth clawed at her, undeniable. She wasn't sure if she wanted to escape anymore. Naima stared at him, her pulse hammering as his words settled over her like a heavy shroud. No one has ever left, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the fire, the flickering glow casting sharp angles across his face. This place, it doesn't let people go, he finally said. A chill curled around her spine, but she refused to let it take hold. That's not true. It can't be. He exhaled, slow and measured. Do you think you're the first to take shelter here? The first to sit by this fire and ask the same questions? Her mouth went dry. What happened to them? His silence was an answer on its own. Naima's gaze swept over the small space, the untouched blankets in the corner, the faint scent of something floral woven into the wood. Had another woman once sat where she sat now? Had she asked him the same questions, felt the same tension in the air? Had she ever left? Her skin prickled. You're keeping me here, aren't you? His eyes flashed, something dark flickering behind them. If I wanted to keep you, I wouldn't have given you the choice to fear me or trust me. She hated how much those words affected her. But none of them left, she whispered, searching his face. Why? His jaw clenched. Because they didn't listen. She should have been terrified. Should have pressed herself against the wall, demanded answers, screamed if she had to. But all she could do was watch him, this man who was both a warning and a mystery. And she wondered, not for the first time, if she had walked into her fate, or if it had been waiting for her all along. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wooden hut, chasing away the shadows that had ruled the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and something unspoken between them. Naima sat motionless as he turned the key in the lock. The soft click echoed in the silence. The door is open, he said. You can go. She should have stood up immediately. Should have rushed outside, breathed in the fresh air of her freedom. But her body remained still, her heart drumming a slow, uncertain rhythm. She had spent the night in the presence of a man she did not know, in a place that should have terrified her. And yet, what lay beyond the threshold now seemed just as uncertain as the darkness she had feared. Naima glanced at him. He was watching her with that same unreadable expression, the one that had both unsettled and drawn her in since the moment she arrived. His presence still filled the space, commanding and unyielding, but something about it was different now. The storm had not just passed outside, it had passed between them, too. She swallowed hard. You're not going to stop me? His lips pressed into a thin line. No. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then why do I feel like leaving isn't the right choice, she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. He exhaled through his nose, almost like he had been expecting the question. Because something brought you here. And something is making you hesitate now. Naima turned toward the door, staring at the sliver of light beyond it. She had spent the night fighting her fear, fighting him, fighting herself. But what if she had been fighting the wrong thing? She could leave. Walk out and never look back. Pretend that this night had been nothing more than a strange and fleeting moment in her life. Or she could stay. Face the unknown, not alone, but with him. The weight of the choice pressed against her ribs, and for the first time in her life, She wasn't sure if freedom meant running, or staying exactly where she was. The village never spoke her name too loudly. They whispered of the night the storm came, the night a lone traveler knocked on the door of a stranger's hut and was never seen again. Some swore she had escaped, slipping away at the first light of dawn, vanishing into the world beyond. But if that were true, why did the elders still warn the young women never to wander too deep into the forest? Why did hunters claim to see shadows moving where no one should be? Some believed she had been claimed by the land, bound to the same fate as the man who once locked the door behind her. Others, in hushed voices, murmured that she had never been trapped at all, that she had chosen to stay. The hut still stood, hidden beneath the thick canopy, untouched by time or decay. On certain nights, when the wind carried strange whispers through the trees, wanderers claimed they saw a dim light flickering from within. No one dared approach. Because they all knew the truth, whether she had stayed by will or by force, Naima was no longer just a woman. She was a story now. A warning. A legend.